right. Well, thanks everyone for showing up. Little short introduction about myself. My name is Ray Johnson, and I am a retired criminal investigator from DuPage County. And I've always been a big fan of Chicago history, history in general, but more Chicago history, since I was a kid, but not when I was in school. So history was just, any history teachers in here? Okay, good. So I'm not going to offend anyone. Maybe out on Zoom, I might offend somebody. So sorry to all you history teachers out there. But it just seemed like it was, you went to class, you learned dates, names, places. You studied what you need to study for the test on Friday, and then you forgot everything you learned a week before. And mainly that's because it really didn't, at least when I was in school, they didn't make history relatable. In other words, you didn't really know why you needed to learn anything. And my thing was always like, why do we need to learn about the Civil War? It was a long time ago. We know who won. Let's move on. But it wasn't until I started doing my own family history, and that's what really got me into loving history, because I do a lot of research and write books on Chicago history. But it was really genealogy that really got me interested in history because you start digging up stuff that you didn't learn about in school. And that's really kind of the interesting stuff because, rightfully, they can't go that deep into any particular topic in school. But in genealogy, you're digging very specifically in a very specific point in time. And you're looking a lot deeper than you would in a class. So that got me really interested. And then the other thing was I found out my mom was adopted when I was 18 years old. And she didn't know who her mom was, although her mother or her grandmother had given her a family Bible and kind of pointed out some names in it. So it was adoption within the family, but it was secret, and nobody wanted to say anything. And she just pointed to a name in the Bible and she said, "Never forget that's your mother." Okay, so it was a name and a birth date. That's all I had. So this is pre-internet. Obviously, I've been doing genealogy for about 40 years. Um, and I did know that since she was adopted, it was probably due to some sort of financial issue. And I figured they're probably receiving some sort of public aid, or so by this point, by the time I was looking into it, Social Security. So at the time, there was no online Social Security death index, there wasn't Ancestry, there wasn't Family Search, but you had the Mormon libraries. So you had the Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, you had family history centers, everything. They had computers, but most stuff was on CDs because there really wasn't an internet at that point. And I knew that they had a Social Security death index. So what I did is I looked up the name on the death index. And what that is, if you're not familiar with the Social Security death index, is that Social Security keeps the names, birth dates, and actually the original applications for anyone who's ever had a Social Security number and passed away. Obviously they have the live people too, but you're not going to get that information. So obviously the person has to be dead. And it was the first database put together by Social Security for employers to check whether or not someone was using a deceased person's Social Security. So it was a public database. And, uh, and so I knew that existed. So I looked it up on the CDs. They updated them about every 4 months. And I didn't find anyone with that name and birth date on the death index. So I knew she had to be alive. And so this won't work today, so don't try it. Or it might, I don't know. I wouldn't though. I went to the local Social Security office and I put together a letter. And of course, I asked my mom's permission. I said, "Do you want to know who your mom is? And if you do you still want to meet her and all that stuff?" She said, "Oh, yeah, we tried for years and couldn't figure it out." And her name was Mary Maloney. So Mary Maloney's in Chicago. There's a lot of them. And the phone books at that time, a lot of times only listed the male, the head of the family. So it was kind of hard to look at. But I walked in with a letter, and it basically said, "I'm your daughter, and if you still want to touch base, here's my contact information." And I went in the Social Security office and I said, "I understand this person with this date of birth is still alive and is probably receiving Social Security benefits. Would you mind putting this letter in with her next check?" And uh, and the woman there said, "Yeah, we're not allowed to do that." And I said, "Well, okay, I understand, but can I just leave it?" And she said, "Sure, you can go ahead and leave it." And so I left it, and 2 weeks later, we get a letter from her mom. And so we actually got to meet her. We showed up the door. She found out she had 13, or no, one was deceased, but she had 15 brothers and sisters that she didn't know about. So we had a big family reunion. It was a big thing. So it was very cool. I went with my mom to first meet them, and the woman that answered the door was my mom's sister. And there was definitely, we didn't need a DNA test because when she opened the door, I was like, looking at my mom, only maybe a little bit thinner. But so it was really neat, and got to meet my biological grandmother, and we knew each other for about 2 years before she passed away, and it was really neat. So she didn't say a lot um, in person unless you asked her. So she wasn't volunteering a lot of information, but I asked a lot of questions, and someone told me, one of the siblings told me that she doesn't talk a lot, but she likes to write. And so, okay, so I gave her a stationery kit for Christmas. And then she died like shortly thereafter. And I'm like, oh, I'll never get a letter from her. And then I went to the funeral, came home, and there was a letter in the mailbox. So must have mailed it right before she died. So really kind of a neat story. But anyway, that got me hooked, and so I've been doing genealogy for a long time. And what we're going to do with this class is normally I would teach this class over. I was teaching this class for adult education. It was like a 3-week course. So I've kind of condensed it down because it's kind of a nice starting place, and we're going to kind of paint with broad strokes. And that's why I kind of put the handout so you don't really have to take a lot of notes, but if you feel like it, by all means. I like to start with a little bit. This was one of the first memes I ever found with, that had to do with genealogy. There's not a lot of them, but I thought it was funny. At least in your genealogy, you'd understand it. Um, Now, I always tell people to start with what you know, which seems obvious, but I mean, start with you. And a lot of people don't do that. And so they want to immediately start going back, and they think their life is boring and nobody's going to care about them or their, kids. But it's not true. I always say, wouldn't it be neat if you could find a journal or something that was written by someone in the 1800s that was part of your family, and then you get an idea of what they did on a daily basis, where they went to school, what they did for hobbies, their favorite color, all that sort of stuff would be really neat to find. So I always say, since you're doing your family history, I'm assuming you're probably going to want to hand this down to someone after you're gone. So I always say, write about yourself first, even though it sounds boring, and most people probably don't listen to me, and you probably won't. But if you do, go ahead and write the story about yourself, and it doesn't have to be very long, but just something that you want people to remember. Um, Also, collect and label all the family photos you can find if you haven't already done that. Because there's nothing more irritating when I work with clients on genealogy projects. They'll have a big trunk of photos and they'll be like, these are really neat photos. We don't know who they are. Because nobody ever wrote on the back of them or said. Sometimes they did. But if you do, make sure you use a felt tipped pen, not a ballpoint pen that could damage the photos. Also, you want to use an archival quality like at a hobby store, they usually sell those. So there's no acid in it, so it doesn't bleed through the picture after a number of years. And then collect all the family documents you can get your hands on. And some of those documents are obvious. Some of them, may seem obvious, but you might forget. Birth, death, marriage certificates, we all know about that. Funeral cards, obituaries, the family Bible, like I said, most people before uh, vital records were necessary would record their family history in the family Bible. And that's where they would keep it because there were no birth certificates or death certificates or marriage certificates. So that's where they wrote stuff down. Military paperwork, now they call it the DD-214. It's basically your discharge papers or the records of military service. Baptismal christening, before there were vital records, people got baptized going way back. So that can substitute as a birth record. Anything educational, diplomas, degrees, report cards, they're nice for putting people in a certain place at a certain particular time because a lot of times locations are important, really important. Um, Newspaper articles, adoption, divorce records, and also, you may not think divorce records are important, but a lot of times there's adoptions mentioned in divorce records that you may not have even known about. Because when people get divorced, if they've ever had children, then you have to work out that sort of an arrangement, especially if they're minors. And then a lot of times adoptions are mentioned in divorce records. And any awards or organizational memberships, because organizations sometimes keep records of their members for a long time. And that's a separate class. We won't get into that today, but that's kind of a separate class altogether as far as using business records and organizational records. And then, of course, interview all the living relatives. I teach the class a lot of times to high school kids, and I said, find the oldest person in your family and talk to them. Because we all remember being kids, and you'd have the older people telling war stories, and you're like, oh no, grandpa's telling stories again, and you want to leave as soon as you can. And then you're like, man, I wish I would have just actually sat down and listened to what they were saying. Question? I do have. I put together because that's what I do when I interview people when I'm writing a family history for somebody or a book. I'll go out and interview people. I'll tape record it, with their permission. And then usually have a list of questions that I ask to keep me on topic, because a lot of times you can get on a sidetrack and you forget, to ask certain things. So we can, in fact, my email is, I'll give you my email at the end. Send me an email and I'll send you the script that I kind of put together when I interview people, and it kind of gives you an idea of the questions to ask. When I interviewed my grandmother, when I got into genealogy pretty young, I was 18, like I said. I interviewed my grandmother, who didn't say a lot. It was on my dad's side of the family. This is a picture of her. Um, she wasn't a real talker, but once I sat down with her and said I wanted to know more about the family, I couldn't stop her. And she started bringing out boxes and photos, and then one thing she did is she mentioned that her grandmother was Native American, and she said she used to take me to the powwow. She called them powwows, and we'd go there, and so she phonetically wrote down everything she could remember as a kid about what was talked about. Now my DNA says I have a very, very small percentage of Native American, actually, less than Elizabeth Warren, if you can believe that. But I haven't been able to prove it. So I haven't spent a lot of time on it, because once I started doing genealogy for other people, I couldn't uh, uh, spend time on it. But I will one day. I did find out that I was related to a clown, so that made sense to a lot of people. And and this was my grandmother's father. His name was William Henderson. He left the family and actually joined the circus. You hear people like leaving and joining the circus. That's what he did. I still haven't found out what circus he was part of. I took the photo to Baraboo, Wisconsin, to the Circus Museum, and they said, judging on the canvas, by the canvas that he's standing in front of, it wasn't Ringling Brothers or any one of the big ones. He was probably part of one of these local, they used to call them carnivals. They were kind of like smaller circuses. But generally speaking, the story with him is he was like a laborer, and most of the clowns, what they were the guys that actually set up all the tents, and then they didn't have any, like, they weren't lion tamers, they weren't trapeze artists. They really had no like special skills, so they dressed him up as a clown and had him run around and make people laugh. So that's kind of how that worked out. I did get pictures of my oldest relatives from Sweden, which was very cool. The house they're standing in front of still exists. It's in really bad shape, but it's still there. I've got photos of it. It was really cool. So when you first start out, it seems simple, or common sense, but just kind of start out with a general ancestor tree. Basically, this is, just you, your parents, their parents, and their parents' parents. And you want to put down as much as you know to keep you on track. And then this way you can kind of see where the gaps are and where you want to start filling in holes. So that's just a starting point. Fill in as many names as possible, full names. For females, always use maiden names. Again, it seems like common sense, but it's hard to find birth certificates for someone under the married name, because you can't. Include birth dates, death dates, marriage dates if known. Always try to use locations wherever possible, because there is Ancestry and Family Search, so those are probably the closest things to a national birth certificate index, but there technically isn't one. So it's always best to know at least what county. I mean, obviously, if you only know the state, that's one thing. At least the county. Really, it's nice if you knew the town, and that's why census records and educational records and stuff like that come into play. Yeah. Yes. Now, find a grave you got to take with a grain of salt, because it's volunteers usually that do the work, and there is no fact checking on find a grave. So someone just adopts a grave, writes what they can about it. Sometimes it's just birth dates, death dates. Some people do it as a hobby. They'll sign up on Find a Grave and they'll go to a cemetery and they'll just start adding graves to the online database, or take a picture of the stone. You can also volunteer to take pictures. So people sometimes go and find a grave, find the relative in a particular cemetery, and then there's no photo of the cemetery, and you don't feel like traveling, across the country to visit the cemetery. They'll put out a request for a photo, and someone local who belongs to Find the Grave will go to the cemetery, take a photo, and upload it. So it's really kind of neat. And that's why location is important too, because again, other than Find a Grave, there's not really, you've got to kind of know what cemetery you're looking for to be able to look up the individual, except for people that volunteer and do that kind of stuff. With a family group sheet, and again, computer programs take care of this. This is kind of like if you're doing it on paper first. Family group sheet is more detailed information about a particular family and children. So there were no children, obviously, in that first ancestor chart, and you do want to know siblings because sometimes the siblings will sometimes give you a way of going back instead of a direct link. So places of birth, city, county, state, country, places of marriage, places of death, occupation, schooling, military, if they were in it, memberships, places of residence, religion, cemetery name and place, and immigration and naturalization information, because that's what you're pretty much going to use among some other things to try to trace back to, unless you were born here in the 1400s, you're probably going to be tracing it somewhere back outside of the United States eventually. And stay organized. So make sure you get a computer program. Some you pay for, some are free. So Legacy Family Tree is a free program online. You don't have to buy it. The free program actually works really well. I forget what version is out there right now, and it's very similar to Family Tree Maker, which I've used since version 1. So I've just stuck with the same one. There's a bunch of them out there. You can Google it. I've used Family Tree Maker ever since they've changed owners like 3 or 4 times. It's worked fine. Legacy also works fine. I've tried it to compare the two. The only thing you can't do with the free version of Legacy is like fancy charts or some of the reports that you get with the paid version of Family Tree Maker. Now you can pay for Legacy to upgrade to the paid version and get all that stuff, but it's really about trying it out and see which one you like. They're pretty much all similar, but I've just gotten used to Family Tree Maker, so that's what I use. And back up all your information because it could be that the purpose of your life is to serve as a warning to others. So, and I've done that. So there's nothing worse than losing records because of an outage or not saving your work. And of course, when you do find information, write down where you found it because you're going to forget where you found that information. And when you actually put something together later on, as long as you have your sources, then else can verify the information pretty easily. Otherwise, you're just putting names, dates, places down, and the person you give it to may be, how do we know this person was correct? And if they're like me and you're a little bit detail oriented, I'll always go, okay, well, where did they get that information from? I didn't know that. How do you document that? So the first thing you usually start with genealogy is vital records, because you're usually starting with the most recent and working back. There is reverse genealogy, where you're starting way back and you're trying to trace forward, which is totally different. That's if you're looking for like living relatives of, second, third cousins or whatever, and you're kind of tracing the family forward, which sometimes you'll do. But especially if you're looking for a family member who might have photos that you don't have and you have no idea they're a family member, and then you find out, and who knows where some of this information went. So DNA is good for that too. So if you've ever done your DNA, it's getting very specific now. It's a lot better than it was when it started out. Actually, I've heard that depending on what you're using it for, if you're using it for matches to other people, then I believe it was Family Tree and an Ancestry or two that are very good at that. 23andMe, it's a lot more medically based. So if you're looking for things like if you have a certain gene for breast cancer, if you have a certain gene for that, that can be scary. So I just did it to find out, and then I didn't want to open it, because I'm like, oh no, I don't want to know, what I could possibly get. And then finally I said, fine, and it gives you a warning, like, the number to call if you need, counseling after you find something out. So that's, luckily it didn't seem like I had anything that they were looking at, but who knows? They keep coming out with new reports. But anyway, vital records. So vital records are actually a pretty recent thing. Vital records, especially like in Illinois, there was no real law concerning vital records until 1917. So before that, it wasn't required. So they could do it. I mean, there were a couple laws, that I traced back, which can give you kind of hints when you trace back what the law was. The first legislation in Illinois was in 1819, a year after we became a state, and it just required doctors to publish births and deaths in newspapers. So, so if a certificate didn't exist, you could always use the newspapers in Illinois to go further back, especially in the small towns and small papers, assuming there's not been a huge fire or natural disaster that killed all the old papers. But that's one way of looking at it. In 1843, there was a legislation that allowed parents, if they wanted to make an affidavit to the courts to say, I had a baby, and this is the baby's name, and this is the date. Now, a lot of people weren't big into doing that because, the closer you go back to the Revolutionary War, we didn't want government involved in a lot. In fact, the Constitution is there to limit what government is supposed to do to get involved in our lives. And a lot of people are like, why should the government want to know how many kids I have and what their names are? They don't need to know. So a lot of people weren't really big into doing it. In 1877, there was legislation passed at the county level, but it wasn't really enforced. So it wasn't until the Illinois Department of Public Health was formed in 1917 that they make it a state law that you had to file birth, marriage, and death records. So fairly recent, yes. They're all similar. So obviously, the further east you go, the older the records get. Somewhere like Massachusetts, the town records is where you're going to go. So the county a lot of times didn't get the records until later, and the town itself kept all the records. So you really have to. That's why I said location is important. So you get to know what location they're from, and then look at the town, county, and state regarding the records and where you can find them. And some of them may be in genealogical societies, the older records. So the state may have thought, what do we need all this for? We need to get rid of it. And the local historical society said, hey, give it to us, we'll hang on to it. So that's always good. Now in Illinois, they have IRAD. So IRAD, if you've never heard of it, is the Illinois Regional Archives Depository. So look it up. It's through the Secretary of State. Just Google IRAD, it'll come up. And you've got a catalog of everything that IRAD has. What it means is that you have local universities to certain geographic areas of Illinois that agreed to take some of the older records from counties and towns that didn't have room for them or didn't want to keep them. So that's what that is. So Cook Counties is at Northeastern University in just on the north side. So really great people. They got volunteers there, but you can look up their catalog online. And you can see what document or what stuff they actually have. Hmm? Nice. Nice, yeah, libraries and a lot of the historical societies, they give them a wing in the library where they can store their books and stuff like that. So yeah, there's always a way of looking. Um, where was I? Let me go back one. There we go. So one of the best online searches for vital records, among other things, is FamilySearch.org. Is anyone familiar with that? Okay, so this is a website that the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints put together. So they collect everything possible having to do with genealogy because that's part of their beliefs. And I'm not going to get into the Mormons, but God love them, they save everything and they put it in a cave in Utah. So hmm yes. So the Catholic Church didn't. There was kind of a falling out between the Catholic Church and the Mormons, having to do with making. So what they'll do is they'll actually, if you have documents like with Cook County, their birth and death records, they agreed to digitize all of their birth, death, marriage records as long as they allowed them to keep a microfilm. So what they'll do is they'll go and they'll do all the work for which is a huge cost savings, and they will set up an office and they will digitize all these documents at no cost to whatever group allows them to do it, as long as they're allowed to keep a microfilm. And they take the microfilm and they put it in their library, which is centered in Salt Lake City, which is basically a large cave where they keep the originals, and then you can go there and do research. But they have a website where you can also do the research locally. Now, what happened was is that since they volunteered to do it, they put the digitized versions online. And Cook County didn't like it because people could go on Family Search and get a copy of a death certificate and not have to pay $17 to Cook County to get a copy. So the way they worked around that is they said, okay, well, we won't put it out there to the general public. However, if you use Family Search at a library or one of their locations, then you can. So most libraries are Family Search libraries, and if you use the computer in the library, the image will be available, and you can save it to a flash drive or whatever. Or all the Mormon churches have a family history center that's open to the public, and you can show up, and they have volunteers that can help you do a lot of research. So, um, the thing is that from what I understand, when I talk to people who are Mormon, they said that they can baptize people after they die, as long as they know, as long as they know who they are and specifically. And so they have a ceremony where they actually baptize people into the Mormon church without your permission. So, and that's when the Catholic Church says, wait, you can't do that. And I'm like, wait a second. First of all, the Catholics don't believe that you can be baptized after you die anyway. So what's it to you what they decide to do with the information? So anyway, there was this falling out. So originally the Catholic Church let them microfilm records, all the church records in Chicago up until about 1915. And then once the Catholic Church found out what they were doing with the information, they said, you can't have any more. So there's a great, they have a great online, and this you don't need to be at a library. You can be at home. You just start a free account, and you can look through all the church records in Chicago, and some of them date back before the fire. So as long as you know the church, you can browse the records, and they'll tell you exactly what they have. And then, a lot of times there's indexes. Me, I like to browse because generally speaking, I know if you know the general date, you can just look through and page through it and go look at that. And then sometimes you find family members you didn't even know existed because you're like, wait, oh, okay, there's the parents, and wait, who's that kid? And then you start adding people that way. So it's a great website, and you can spend a lifetime getting to learn it because familysearch.org. Yeah, yeah, it's in the handouts. Yeah. And then what you get is something like this. You run somebody, you'll get an index. Of course, the index is only as good as the people that interpreted the records. So a lot of these are handwritten records. So this is just a relative of mine that I ran just to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like. But basically, they took his death certificate and all the information on it and made an index to it. So basically, they have all the information, just not see it says image unavailable. So that's what I did from home. Now, if you were in the library, you'll see an image of the death certificate. You can click on it and download it. So there's a lot more information on the death certificate that's not in this kind of what they decided to put in the index, because I don't think it mentions cause of death, stuff like that. But that would be on the death certificate. But it's a neat site. Ancestry, of course, we're all familiar with Ancestry. At least most of us are. I use it probably daily. This is to give you an example. The nice thing about Ancestry is that when you do find a relative, I did the same thing with John Maloney. They also have the death index from Cook County, so you can find the same John Maloney information on Ancestry. Of course, you have to pay for Ancestry unless you have to go to the library and use it for free, or you can get the free version for a couple weeks. So if you get all your information together, you can crank on Ancestry for 2 weeks for free. I don't know how much you'll be able to get done. Yeah, I know. You want to get the paid version. So I've had it for years. But the nice thing is that it gives you hints. So here you have John Maloney, but then the program itself goes out and says, okay, well, here's all the records that we have that are probably the same John Maloney. So then you have like the 1860 census, the database of veterans index, the Ohio County marriage records. I'm like, well, that's probably not him, but I'm going to look at it because I don't think he ever went to Ohio. So it just kind of guesses as to what um, your person is and what records may exist in their database that include more information on John Maloney in different databases. There's also the Illinois State Archives, which a lot of people forget about or didn't know about in the first place. So the state archives are actually in Springfield, but they have a website, and they have, when you go into databases under the Illinois State Archives, it's actually run by the Secretary of State. They have a lot of really cool databases that don't exist anywhere else because they haven't given them the ancestry, and they used volunteers at the state archives to do this stuff. So they have stuff like Civil War veterans serving in the U.S. Navy, Illinois Mexican War veterans, Illinois soldiers and sailor home residents. And so there's all these databases that you may not even know existed. So if you go to the Illinois State Archives, that's a great site. The three major databases they have are the statewide marriage index, which goes all the way back to 1763. Now you might think that's kind of funny, but since we weren't even a state until 1818, but we were part of the British government in 1763. So this goes back to when Illinois was part of Britain. And before that, it was part of France. And so if you really want to go into the old records of Illinois, you have to go to Canada and it'll be in French. So the further you go back, and then of course, 1776 and that whole thing, and then we eventually the Louisiana Purchase and stuff like that. So, but they have records going all the way back to 1763 as far as marriages, at least in the index. But it only goes to 1900. But then again, you have ancestry and family search to help with that. What you get when you search someone in the index, in the marriage index, is you could search by groom or bride, and it's very simple. You just put in the last name. Sometimes I like to do a shotgun approach and just put in a last name with no first name and just kind of scroll down until I find the person, because you never know sometimes how they spell names and whatnot. And so I start with the most general, and then I kind of work my way in. So and basically the index is just, it shows this one's organized by groom. So I was looking at my wife's family, their last name, her maiden name is Daniel, so I just put in Daniel. And then the bride's names are on the right. Obviously, they're not in alphabetical order. It's based off the groom on this one. You could do the reverse and run the bride's name, and then it would, put all the brides in alphabetical order and match them up with their spouses. And then you have a date of marriage and a certificate number and what county they were married in. So if you wanted to get the certificate and you can't find it on Ancestry or Family Search, at least you know it exists. And then you get the certificate number and you can order it from the county, whatever county comes up, you know. Then you go to Ancestry and Family Search. They have a lot of the more recent ones, and they keep updating the database, so they get fairly recent now. The also the death index. So here you have this is just a more close-up look at the index. So that's all you're going to get, but it's a lot of good information because you have, if you're running the bride's name is their maiden name. So you could run a maiden name and find out who they married, and if you weren't aware of the marriage, then at least you know what their married name was, and then you can look at a death certificate, because a lot of times you don't know who they married, later on. You've got their birth record, but then no record of who they became once they got married. So that helps. One thing that Ancestry does have that a lot of people are unaware of is the Sam Fink Index. They don't call it that on Ancestry. It's called the, I got a slide. But Sam Fink was a genealogist who went out and, the fire of 1871 killed all the county records. So you're not going to be able to go to Cook County and say, can I get this death record from 1863? They're going to look at you funny and say, yeah, there was this big fire in 1871, everything burned. So that's why, in Chicago, a lot of people don't know about the Great Fire. And so I get people contacting me from out of state saying, yeah, I'm looking for my death certificate of my grandfather, and he died in 1863. And I'd be like, well, yeah, good luck. But now what Sam Fink did, you won't find a certificate, but Sam Fink went through the newspapers. He went through all the Chicago newspapers that existed at the time he did this and wrote down or typed out by hand all the death obituaries, marriage announcements, everything, and then created his own index, which was eventually sold to Ancestry. So what you want to do when you run someone in that is you're going to see, and when you look on Ancestry, it'll say about these records. You want to click on that, because when you find someone in that index and you click the little link, it's going to take you to a page that looks like this, only a lot bigger. And you find your person, and there's the date. In this case, I think it was, I think this is a death record, because it doesn't really say. But when you search, it'll tell you whether it's a death or marriage record, and obviously there'd be a spouse's name. But it gives you the date, and there's these little symbols in the right-hand column. Those were the newspapers. He had a symbol for each newspaper that he checked. So then you could go back to the original microfilm at the Chicago Library and actually look up the obituary for that particular person. So it was a lot of work, so I give him a lot of credit. This is, you don't have to write this down. Again, if you go on Ancestry, they'll give you the same index, but he used the Chicago Tribune, the Times, the Evening Journal, the Democrat, Democratic Press, the Evening Post, Record Herald, Daily News, Examiner, and the Inter-Ocean. And each one of these symbols relate to one of those newspapers. And some of them had multiple symbols. So the obituary would have been listed in multiple papers. And you could check each one because sometimes you get a different wording or something in a different paper. So really good index. On Ancestry, it's called the Cook County, Illinois Marriage and Death Index 1833 to 1889. Me personally, I like to just run a generic name, and then I'll go to browse records. That's always a neat option. So you can, in the upper right, see a little thing that says browse. You can just go straight to the death index and just go page by page by page if you wanted to, without using their index. All right, Chicago Genealogical Society also put together a record of Chicago deaths pre-fire from 1847 to 1863. Now, how did they find out who died? Well, before the Chicago fire, most people in Chicago who died were buried at the city cemetery. The city cemetery existed in Lincoln Park. So Lincoln Park, what we know as Lincoln Park now, was just a big cemetery. Now it's a park. But before the Great Fire, it was nothing but a cemetery, and a big cemetery. There was like 30,000 people that were buried in the city cemetery prior to the fire. Now, the records, of course, there weren't death certificates, they weren't required, but the sexton, the guy who ran the cemetery, had to make a report to the city council about all the people he buried, names, dates of death. So he had to make a report of everyone he buried in the cemetery. Well, after the fire, they thought those records were lost when someone eventually found a box of documents in the basement of some building, and they said, here's all the old Chicago City council minutes. And so the Chicago Genealogical, they were housed at IRAD, and so that's where they moved them to. And so the Chicago Genealogical Society went through all the Chicago City Council minutes, and they wrote down who was buried and when, and they published it in the book called Chicago Cemetery Records 1840 to 1863. And you can buy it still from their website, and there are libraries that have it. So check, your local library, see if they have a copy of it. So if you're looking for information further back, that exists too. Church records. Again, a lot of these are going to be on Family Search, but the Newberry Library has a website called chicagoancestors.org. Really neat database. So the best thing about it is that if you know where your relatives lived, let's say you were looking at a census record or in a directory or something, and you had their address in Chicago, but you weren't sure what church they went to, you weren't sure what was going on in their area, whatever, you can type an address into this mapping system, and it will zoom in, depending on what parameters you give it. If you say, I want everything within a mile, a half mile, whatever, it'll give you all the Catholic churches or any church or civil buildings or anything like that that existed way back. So it's like, even if the church doesn't exist anymore, it'll be on the map. And so what they'll do is you can pinpoint, okay, we knew they're a Catholic. They probably went to the closest, and it was usually by ethnic group. So you had the closest Irish Catholic church, closest Polish Catholic church, but you weren't sure which one it was. You can type the address in, it'll tell you what was the closest church to their house. Now, the neat thing is that they have a link. Once you do the search, it gives you a list of all the important things that happened at the time and links to other databases. But if you look at the church and click on the church, they'll tell you exactly what records exist in Family Search for that church, and they'll actually give you the film numbers. So if you go to Family Search for that film number, you can go straight to those records without having to do a search on Family Search. Does that make sense? Because you can search by film number. Well, let's say this was the church you believe they went to. They tell you when it was organized, when it opened, when it closed, who it merged with if it merged. So it's really neat because a lot of churches would close, and the people that went to that church moved to a different church. And this will tell you. So if you know they were living in 1890 and this particular church closed in 1880, then it'll tell you where everyone went after that. And so you know what church they would have transferred to once they moved or once they moved in. Yes, this is just for Chicago. And then the church records exist, like I said, generally to about 1915 at Family Search. And then you're actually looking at digitized books, basically. And this is kind of the Family Search thing. Where? Everything before 1915. And a lot of them predate the fire. So I found a marriage record for my relatives I know they got married in 1860, and they were at Old St. Mary's Church. They were Irish on the south side. And it was pretty much the only church that existed at the time in that area. So those records still exist, and I found their marriage record. So I knew they were at least here in 1860. And there's a whole other story. Their house was 3 blocks southwest of the O'Learys. So their house wasn't burned, but they could see the whole city burned from where they were. And luckily, the winds were blowing the opposite direction. So yeah, that had to be fascinating. Whole family story about that, but we won't get into it because we don't have a lot of time. So this is what the church records will typically look like. Some might be in Latin, depending on what the priest, what they were using as far as the language of the church at the time. It's really no different. The Latin would be like the uh, top labels, but generally speaking, they're pretty easy to decipher. It's not very difficult. This is just some of the stuff that they'll have on there. Obviously, the death record, they'll mention what cemetery, they'll mention when they died. Some of them may mention something about what country they came from, or say that he was, they'll put a little note in there, married in this town in Poland or something, and so it gives you a clue on where to look, sometimes. So you never know what you're going to find in the church records, depending on what the priest is doing. Now, vital records are not foolproof, obviously. because sometimes people lie, sometimes people don't know. Somebody dies, they didn't know anything about their spouse's history, and then you get the certificate that says father unknown, mother unknown, which is very frustrating. But so they're not foolproof. I mean, they exist. It's not written in stone. This is my grandfather's death certificate. He was befriended by someone who just looked for old guys that were VA veterans because they got benefits, and then basically, waited for them to die and collect their, it was a horrible situation. But she was technically his guardian, not my mother. And so it was a big court battle. But anyway, she was the informant on the death certificate, because when you look at a death certificate, generally there'll be an informant. Sometimes they'll just say hospital records. Sometimes it might say a name, and then you got to figure, oh, was that the spouse that provided the information? But she had gotten his parents wrong. But luckily, when I sent for his birth certificate, which, just because they weren't required doesn't mean they don't exist. So I took a shot. He was born in 1908. I sent a request to the state, actually, because at one point they were doing it for free. And I knew his name, I knew his date of birth, and I knew his parents' names, but I didn't know much else. And so I sent for it, and they sent it, but his name wasn't even on it. They hadn't chosen a name for him yet. So, but the parents' names matched up and his date of birth matched up. I know his name was James Wesley Case, but the name of child was blank on the certificate because they hadn't chosen a name yet. So sometimes it might just say female, because the hospital's filling it out and they're like, well, what's the name of the child? Oh, we haven't decided yet. Okay, female. And that's what's on there. Obituaries and cemeteries is like some of my favorite topics. I love going through cemeteries. I'm just weird that way. I don't know about you guys, but it's so much fun sometimes to read what people put on their stones, because some of it's pretty interesting. Now, online newspapers, newspapers.com is indispensable. I've had a subscription forever. It's just great sometimes to browse through old newspapers and see what they were talking about and what was going on at the time. But obviously, if you're looking for obituaries, stuff like that, it's newspapers.com keeps adding more and more newspapers to their database. And they're all over the world. So it's not just US papers. They have a lot from the UK, a lot of foreign newspapers in there as well. If you're looking for foreign language obituaries, the Newberry is actually the best place to go for that. Because if you have relatives that spoke a particular language coming over, a lot of times they wouldn't put the obituary in an English-speaking paper. It would be in a German paper or a Polish paper. And the Newberry has the largest collection of foreign language newspapers in Chicago. Legacy.com is good for recent obituaries because a lot of people stopped publishing in the newspaper because it was expensive. And then the internet came out and they said, oh, we could put an obituary in the internet for 10 bucks and it stays there forever, or until the website shuts down. But legacy.com is one of the biggest, so a lot of funeral homes use that. So if you check legacy.com, a lot of times you can find a lot of the more recent obituaries if they don't have the recent editions of the paper on newspaper.com. And like I said, a lot of the more recent funerals, the people just forego the newspaper and go straight to Legacy because they put pictures on it and all that sort of stuff. A lot cheaper. As far as Chicago newspapers in general, the Chicago Public Library downtown, the Herald Washington, has the largest collection of Chicago newspapers going all the way back to the 1840s. A lot of them are on, sometimes the indexes are on newspapers.com. Sometimes they don't because I haven't added them yet. So a lot of times you got to go do it the old-fashioned way, going down the Chicago Public Library, request a microfilm for a particular year, and just do it the old-fashioned way and start going through microfilm page by page by page, which I kind of like doing because you start reading about other things that you weren't really interested in, and all of a sudden something catches your eye, and you're like, well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. And then you go down a rabbit hole and you forget why you were there in the first place. But that's just me. So what you can do with the death index, which is nice, is if you want to narrow down a particular person before you order a death certificate, if you're not really sure, like my relative was John Maloney. There are a lot of John Maloneys in Chicago. So how could I know that the John Maloney that I was looking for was the guy I was looking for? Because I didn't know what day he died. So there's a lot of death certificates for John Maloney, and I don't want to spend $17 for 35 certificates to find one out of the group. So the newspapers are nice for that because you may know other people's names that were in the family, and then when you look at the obituaries, then you can see which one lines up, and now you know what date he died, or at least close. So like on this one, I knew what date range he would have died. And so I went to the state archives and I did the search of all the John Maloney's that died in Chicago, in Cook County in that date range, and just looked up each newspaper for that date or within 1 or 2 days of the date, and eventually narrowed it down. And I found out when he died, and then I ordered the right certificate. So um, one interesting little thing, when I was in the library doing this, I was still fairly new at doing genealogy. I'm going through microfilm, and there was an older gentleman, probably my age now, who was sitting next to me, and he said, "Oh, what are you looking for?" And I said, "I'm looking for an old obituary." And he must have been a genealogist, and he's like, "Oh, what's the name?" And I said, "John Maloney." And he goes, "Oh, good Southside Irish name." He goes, "What newspaper are you looking at?" I said, "The Tribune." He goes, "You're not going to find it there." I'm like, "Really?" He said, "The Tribune hated the Irish. They wouldn't even publish their obituaries." I'm like, "Really?" And he goes, "Look in the Daily News." I'm like, "Okay." So I couldn't find it in the Trib. I looked in the Daily News, and there it was. And I'm like, "What?" And then I always wondered why my mom never bought the Tribune when I was growing up. So I'm not saying the Tribune still hates Irish people. I'm just saying that it was a long time ago that McCormick didn't like the Irish, and so he refused to publish Irish obituaries in the paper. So, and then that must have been handed down because for some reason my mom hated the Tribune, and she didn't even know why. I said, "Why do you hate the Tribune?" "I don't know. We just never bought the Tribune." So it just got handed down. And I was like, "Well, now I know where we got the Sun Times." Um, so what information can you get from a death notice? You got marriage information, a list of children, sometimes with the husband's name, maiden name of the deceased, which is always nice. Many times the deceased home, if they were a first generation immigrant, a lot of times they might mention what town and country they're from. That's always best to know the town when you're looking overseas. Church information comes in handy for later research. Cemetery info, always walk a cemetery. We'll get into that. And then what organizations or clubs they may belong to, because a lot of times you'll see in the obituary was a member of this order or that order or this fraternal group. And a lot of those agencies and groups, when you figure out what the initials mean, have their own records, and so there's another place you can look. This was the Chicago Daily News where I found John Maloney. There he is. And I knew what his wife's name was, so I lined them all up. But the neat thing is I saw some names in there that I didn't know before. Mrs. Joseph Cody. Okay, well, one of the daughters married a Cody, so now I knew what her married name was, and when I looked for it, then I could find her death record. So that's what obituaries are really good for. The church it went to, they went by train, which most people did, to Mount Olivet. That was his death certificate that I ordered. Which brings me to cemetery research. So I love cemetery research. This was a photo I took of the mausoleum at not Oak Ridge, I think is what it's called. It's on Roosevelt, just west of Wolf Road. I was looking for, sometimes I just like to look for famous people in the cemetery. So I was looking for the author of Little Orphan Annie, and I knew he was buried there. So I went to the office, and they said, "Oh, he's in the mausoleum," but they didn't have an exact location. So I had to walk the whole mausoleum. And so I was by myself and it was dark and my shoes were making noise. And I started having visions of all the horror movies I've ever seen, and started getting a little jittery. And they had these lights that would turn on, motion sensors as you walk through, and then they would turn off behind you. And you're like, "This is creepy." And then I come across this, which I thought was really funny. This is not Photoshopped, by the way. Um, so I took a picture of it. I had to, and I put it on a blog I was writing at one point, and I just put this person's gravestone on it. He was still alive. He must have read the blog, and then he contacted me, and he was laughing, and he said, that's my. Uh, I'm not dead yet, but I thought it'd be funny to put that on there. Now, when I went back, I saw the other date filled in, so obviously he's gone now, but it was pretty funny at the time. So if you're going to do cemetery research, always phone first if possible, because a lot of cemeteries' records aren't technically at the cemetery that you're going to. So sometimes they've combined, like even in the Catholic cemeteries, some of the offices are combined now to save money. So if you go to not Casimir, I think Holy Sepulchre, I think combined offices, and they always change. But when you walk into the in a Catholic cemetery, usually they have the kiosk there, and you look the person's name up. Now, some people are purposely left off that kiosk, so like you can't find certain names of everyone knows where Al Capone's grave is, but you won't find him on the kiosk because they didn't want people, but it's not a big secret where he is. It used to be. They originally buried him in Mount Olivet on the south side of Chicago. And then at night, they moved him without anybody knowing to Mount Carmel because they didn't want people digging up his. He still had a lot of enemies on the south side of Chicago, and they didn't want people digging up his grave and doing funny things. So they left the marker at Mount Olivet, but actually moved the body to Mount Carmel. And then there's no gangsters left from the 1930s, so they felt safe enough to actually put his name on the stone over at Mount Carmel with the rest of his family. But always check the weather forecast. I know that sounds funny. Nothing worse than walking around in the cemetery in the rain or in the snow, because then if they've got a flat stone, good luck, if it's covered with 2 feet of snow. Bring with you a camera, paper, pen, pencils, grass clippers, a little shovel. I'm not saying digging it up, but a lot of times the gravestones will sink, and then it's covered with grass, and you got to kind of pull stuff away, especially if it's not really taken care of well. Have the family info with you. That's not a joke. I would, for sometime, one time I went and I forgot the documents at home, and I got to the cemetery and I'm like, oh crap, like I didn't even know who I was looking for, or names and dates. And like, ask politely for the plot card. Now, most people go to the desk and they say, I'm looking for the grave of so and so, and they're like, oh, okay, and they look it up and they come back with a little piece of paper and a map and they say, this is section so and so, blah blah blah, and they send you on your way. Not everyone has a stone. And a lot of times there's multiple people buried in a family plot that you wouldn't know about unless you asked, because they're not going to give you all the names of the people in the plot they're buried in. They're just going to give you the name of the person you're looking for. So always ask for the plot card, just nicely, because they'll be like, this person knows what they're doing. And they'll usually have no problem giving you a copy of it. And then you see where other people may be buried that don't have a stone. Ask if any other persons with the same last name are buried close by. Sometimes they can search that and say, oh, especially if you have an uncommon name, you could say, well, are there any so-and-sos close by? And they can pull out, they have different indexes they can look through, geographic, by last name, kind of thing. And then walk the area too. So just in case there was someone that you didn't know was buried there, and you come across and you're like, oh, I remember that name from somewhere. Who is that? And it was like, oh, that was cousin so-and-so. Um, Mount Olivet Cemetery is where John was buried. This was the plot card I originally asked for. This is before they computerized it, so they gave me a copy of the typewritten card. And so these were all relatives that were buried in the same plot as John Maloney. None of them had stones. But in this one, they actually give you the interment box, the size of the interment box. So John Maloney had a 6-foot casket, and then Edward Stapleton only had a 2-foot casket. So he was either really short or it was a child that was buried. So it kind of gave you some hints, because they just have a date of interment, not a date of death. So the date they were buried, not necessarily the date they died, the size of the box, and the location in the plot. The new digitized version doesn't have all that information on it, and unfortunately, if you're really nice, you could say, hey, do you have that old typewritten one? I kind of wanted to get a copy of that. Sometimes they'll dig it up for you. When I did this at Calvary Cemetery, there was no stone at all. I was looking for John Maloney's wife, and she was buried at Calvary Cemetery. He was buried at Mount Olivet. It's a long story. It's not like they didn't like each other. It's just that Mount Olivet wasn't open yet when his wife died. So the Irish were buried at Calvary on the north side until they opened up Mount Olivet on the south side. Then you were buried on the south side because it was more convenient. So when I asked for the plot card, it was 3 index cards long. So basically, we had 27 relatives that were buried in 8 graves. So they used to be able to stack people because of cost. And the ones at the bottom here are the oldest ones, and they were buried before the cemetery existed in 1864. So going back to the city cemetery, when we were talking about Lincoln Park, after the fire, they said, it's too expensive. This land is too expensive just to bury people here. Chicago's getting bigger. They could build huge buildings. So we're going to move everybody. They said it was due to health reasons. So they had to dig everybody up and move them to different cemeteries all over to free up that land. Well, once the fire hit, they started in the 1860s moving bodies. The fire hit, all the records were destroyed. A lot of the markers were wood, so they burned too. And if they didn't have a stone, there's no stone, there's no record, there's no body. So there's estimated to be at least 10,000 people still buried under Lincoln Park. And that was John Maloney's stone. It looked like it was hand carved. It didn't look like a very professional stone. And it's the first time I've ever seen Maloney spelled with an O. So it's always been M.A. So I'm like, they either made a mistake or our name changed, a little bit since he died. And then, of course, you mentioned Find a Grave. That's a great resource. So if you're, again, it's volunteers that do it. Sometimes you'll find a family member that you never knew before because you'll go to a gravesite and you're like, oh, there's already a Find a Grave for it. And then you look at the person who, there will be a link to an email of the person that created that that entry, and then you can contact them if you have any other questions or if you think it's a family member. Obviously, sometimes it's obvious when they do the whole family story of the person. They obviously knew the person who died. Sometimes it's just the dates that, or what's written on the stone. So it really just depends. Um, this was one for Mayor Bergovi when I was doing research on Resurrection Mary, the ghost around how. So I wanted to find out who she really was and that sort of stuff. So someone created one for Mayor Bergovi, and it mentions that she was Resurrection Mary and that all stuff. It used to be all wrong information until I started researching it and then putting it out, and then whoever started the grave, took my information and updated it. So it was kind of nice. But she was a real person. And then they have tombstone transcription projects. So you have aside from Find a Grave, you have independent gravestone transcription projects all over. So if you just Google gravesite transcriptions, there's usually more today than there were yesterday. Two big ones are the Tombstone Transcription Project and then internment.net. So these are all volunteers. They go around. It's separate from Find a Grave. A lot of times it's duplicate information sometimes, or sometimes you'll find stuff on interment.net that's not on Find a Grave. So you have to kind of check around. And sometimes the cemetery itself will have an online database as well. Which ones? Transcription Project and Interment. So these are sites, private sites that somebody set up for free and as a hobby, or it's not a business, you don't have to pay for it. Kind of like Find a Grave. I mean, you don't have to pay to get on that. And they just before Find a Grave, I think interment.net is older. Find a Grave became more popular. But interment.net existed before Find a Grave. And so they have volunteers all over the country that go out and write down everything, all the tombstones in a cemetery or a portion of the cemetery. They basically, you go on here and people adopt the cemetery. So if there's a cemetery listed that there's nothing listed for, you can request to adopt that cemetery, and you can go out on your free time and walk the cemetery and write down all what's on all the gravestones, and then come home and type it out and then upload it. And a lot of people do that. So and that's nice because a lot of times stones don't exist forever. And also records sometimes don't exist forever. Sometimes there's floods, there's fires, and sometimes cemeteries are just left to rot, and there's no owners and everything just goes to pot. So it's kind of nice to have these online databases in case cemeteries disappear. I did some research out in Pennsylvania. I was looking for a relative of mine who lived on the poor farm. He was a cripple. His name was Crawford Duncan. We were taking a trip to DC. We stopped in Pennsylvania at Cumberland County to do some research at the Historical Society. I walk in, a woman greeted me at the Historical Society. She says, "Oh, who are you looking for?" And I said, Crawford Duncan. She laughed. She goes, "Oh, we're related." And she said, "Everyone's related to Crawford Duncan." I'm like, "Really?" And she goes, "Yeah, here's a high school project that was done on Crawford Duncan." I'm like, "You're kidding me. Where's he buried?" Nobody knows. So what he used to do is he carved tombstones for a living. So because he became crippled, he couldn't do farm work. So his leg was he could use his hands, but he couldn't use his legs. So he made money carving people's tombstones by hand. But then when he died, there was no one to carve a tombstone, and they don't know where he's buried. So I never found his. I thought I found it because I looked through someone had done a transcription, and I found his name, Crawford Duncan, and I'm like, I found it. Well, what happened is since this is one of the ones he carved, high school student was going around. He was like a local artist. He had a very specific way that he did things. And so this was all done by hand. And he signed this one. So when someone went through and did a cemetery transcription, they wrote down Crawford Duncan, Perry County, not knowing that it was the guy who actually created the tombstone and he wasn't actually buried there. So I was all excited thinking I'm going to find his gravesite. And I went, no, he just signed the dang stone. So how much time do we got? A little bit of time. Oh, so we're pretty much done. Yeah, 11:30. Yeah. What time do you want to be out of the room? Oh, okay. Okay. I would shoot for 12, if that's fine. So, okay. Like I said, it's a day course I'm trying to shrink down to an hour and a half now. Good, we got a little time. So federal records is something you're going to come across. There's a lot of them. We're just going to go around, go over some of the basic ones. Social Security Administration, we talked a little bit about that. It started in 1935. Technically, the law was passed, so it hasn't been around forever. Cute story, I was doing research for a guy that was looking for a Civil War pension. Um, and in 1930, the Veterans Administration began. And so in 1930, there were still people getting Civil War pensions. And because the widow could file for a pension, and a lot of these older veterans would marry these young women because they had pensions, and the women liked having the monthly money coming in. And so they would marry someone really young, and then she lived for a long time. And then her kids could file a pension. And so those Civil War pensions went pretty far into the future. They weren't big, but it was something, and they kept them. So in 1930, the VA took that over, and the active Civil War pensions were transferred to the Veterans Administration. Um, so basically, this guy was looking for the pension records, and when I went to the VA, they said, "Well, what was his Social Security number?" And I said, "No, he was a Civil War veteran. He didn't have a Social Security number." And they said, "Well, we need a Social Security number." I said, "He didn't have one. I can't make one. I'll make one up if you want, but And they said, "Then we can't look it up." Like, okay, so his Civil War record is somewhere lost in one of the federal record houses. They can't look up because he doesn't have a Social Security number. So I thought it was, and I said Social Security didn't exist during the Civil War, and I just got this blank stare. I'm like, never mind. So anyway, so in 1936, the applications for Social Security were sent out to the employers, and then the employers actually filled it out with the employee, and then that application was then returned to the post office, which then typed them out, all nice and neat, and then sent them to the federal government. So there was no technically rhyme or reason or numbering system other than really the two center numbers of your Social Security number relate to the state that you had gotten it. So there were only certain numbers issued to certain states. Um, so I just like some Social Security trivia. So who had the first Social Security record created? Like the first one. So, and of course, it wasn't 001, 00001 because there was no order that they came back in. So yeah, they were ordered, but when they sent them out, people just filled them out and sent them back. And the Social Security Administration would just take the first one and just, as they were coming in, enter them. So he got the first Social Security card. So his number was 55090001. John David Sweeney, age 23. That's his claim to fame. I don't know who he is, but I thought it was neat. Who received the first Social Security benefit? That would be this guy, Ernest Ackerman. He retired one day after Social Security started. He had a nickel taken out of his pay and received a one-time lump sum of 17 cents. So he tripled his money. So he didn't do too bad. And then this is my all-time favorite. She's my stick it to the man person of the year. She received the first monthly benefits check. So before they would just give, when you retired, they give you a lump sum and that was it. And then they started giving you monthly benefits. So this woman is the first person that received a monthly check from Social Security. She retired in 1939. Her first check was $22. Her total contributions to Social Security were $24.75, and she received over $22,000 because she said, "I'm going to get one of these every month for as long as I live." And then so she said, so she lived to be 100 years old. She goes, "I'm going to get as much money out of this as I can." So very cool. But they do have a master list of everyone who died after 1935 and was issued a Social Security number. You used to be able to get, well, they still update it daily, but there was a law passed that it was really dumb. I'm not going to get into it, but Congress passed the law because they said, "Oh, well, we want to protect children, and so we're not going to let people get deceased people's Social Security numbers that are less than 10 years old." So before you can get it right up to date, and there's no rhyme or reason for that. They're the only Social Security numbers that are flagged. So someone could use your Social Security number and nothing will get flagged until you try to collect. And then all of a sudden they're like, "Wait, this is way too much money." So some people are like, "I'm just going to hand my Social Security card out to all these people that want to work." And then basically they're paying into your Social Security. And then eventually when you go to collect, the federal government says, "Something's wrong here because there's no way that you worked 300 hours a week, So anyway, but it's not flagged. Someone could use your Social Security number and it's not good. But if you were dead, it is flagged. So So I don't understand the law. But anyway, you can still get it. It used to be free online. Now you have to actually go through Ancestry, and it's only those people. They've got to be 10 years old. So I think now it's probably till 2015 you can get the index. Now, what's the importance to that is that once you find the person on the index, and you don't need to, if you have a death certificate and you know they had a Social Security card, you can go right to the Social Security's website and get their original application that they filled out when they filled out for Social Security. So just through a FOIA request. A little expensive. I think it's like 25 bucks, $27 if you don't know the Social Security number. But what this does is you can run it, and then it gives you a link right to the Social Security page, which will take you to their FOIA request. And basically, this is what you'll get back. So if you request the original SS5 that the person filled out, you'll get their name, the address they were living at, where they were working when they first filled out their Social Security card, the address of the place. The nice thing about this is that you had to be very specific on what country you came from. So if you're really looking for the town where someone was born outside of the country and you can't figure that out, and a lot of times church records, you got to know what town they're from, otherwise there's no international database. This will tell you what town and country they were born at. So that's the real important thing, I think, with this. This was funny because they said it was unlawful to send your application back before November 24th. And here they typed in November 23rd, so I don't think they really cared. But kind of a neat thing to look at. Census records. So the census has been taken every 10 years since 1790. The purpose of which, if you didn't know, was to assign how many representatives will be assigned to your state. So we only have 435 representatives, and we divvy those out depending on the population of the state. Illinois lost a representative from the last census. California lost a seat in Congress because as your population shrinks, you get less representatives. But it's divvied out depending on the percentage of population. The information on the early ones, there wasn't a lot. It was generally just the head of the family, the male. They didn't take any, unless the female was the head, then they would list her. But if the husband died and the female was the head of the family, she would be listed. And then basically in the 1791, it's just head of the family and how many people under the age of 20, under the age of 10, under the age of, and male or female. So not a lot, but you can put people in a particular place and time. Starting in 1850, they listed the whole household, but the relationships in the household, which, you know, you can kind of guess at, you know, if you had one adult male, one adult female, and a bunch of kids listed, then you can kind of think that they were their sons or daughters, but they weren't listed on the census as such, just the list of people. Starting in 1880, they listed the relationships: wife, son, son-in-law, cousin, uncle, whatever. It was a door-to-door canvass through 1950. The 1950 is the latest, the most recent census that you can get access to. There's a 72-year waiting period for the census has come out. 1950 was released in 22. In 1890, unfortunately, the census burned. So that's the frustrating thing about the census. You're going to have 1880, and then it's going to jump to 1900 because the 1890 census doesn't exist anymore. They do have some other smaller censuses that were taken, like the Union Veterans Census, that you can access, but the full federal census was destroyed, and there's no copies of it. Like I said, there was a special 1890 census. The formats and questions change every year. Of course, now they just mail it to you and you send it back. Of course, if you don't send it back, then they're going to send someone to your door. So, you know, they still do door-to-door canvassing, but only when someone doesn't answer the mail-in. Now, Sondexes you don't have to worry about unless you're going to do manual searching through the actual microfilm at the National Archives. So Ancestry and Family Search both have digitized versions of the census. You're not going to have to go through microfilm unless someone messed up in the index and you really can't find anyone on Ancestry or Family Search. Then you may have to go back and do it the old-fashioned way and go down to the Great Lakes region of the National Archives on Pulaski, and they will walk you through looking through the old microfilms to find them. And then you'd have to know what a Soundex is, because there's a Soundex index. Now, Soundex is, and you may run into this in other places, you don't have to worry about it on Ancestry or anything like that, unless you want to browse some of the records, because it's organized by Soundex. A Soundex is a way of taking these foreign names with 26 vowels and 36 consonants, usually from Poland or somewhere in Eastern Europe, and you go, there's way too many, that's too many consonants in a row. You know, you can't do that, you know, ZYK and all that. So what they did is they created the Soundex to basically tried to take all the names that sounded similar and group them together. So it got rid of a lot of the characters. So basically, I included in the handout a little manual way of doing it. Now you can go to the internet since the internet came out, and you can type in a last name. It's called a Soundex calculator. You just type in Google Soundex calculator. It'll be the first thing comes up. You click on it, you type in a last name, and it'll convert it to a Soundex code for you. But if you find yourself out in the middle of nowhere in an old courthouse and no one has access to the internet, the way you do that is you use the guide that I included. Take the first letter of the last name, that becomes the first. You write the name out on the first one, right? Yeah. So like with Johnson, I know my Soundex is J525. So the Johnson Soundex is J525. Jones is J525. Johnson spelled with an E is J525. Because what they do is you take the first letter and then you cross out all the vowels, get rid of them. And then each letter after that gets a number. And it only goes out to 4 numbers. So all the extraneous letters at the end drop off. So basically, if you only have, you know, if the name was Case, okay, you've got last name Case. So you take the C, you get rid of the A and the E, and the only thing left is the S. So the S becomes a 2, and anything left, there's zeros. So the Soundex for Case would be C200. So that's the way to do it. And then it's organized by first name. So if you're looking for, if you find yourself having to look in a Soundex index, convert the last name, then it'll be organized. So all the A's will be first. So it'll be like Alex Jones, and then it'll be Alex Johnson, you know, because they all have the same Soundex, and the first names are the ones alphabetized. Does that make sense? So if you run into that, that's the way to do it. It works though, because if you have something like Kozlowski that could be spelled a million different ways, you get rid of all those extra letters, and then any way they spell it, it's going to come out to be the same Soundex, or at least very close. So, well, double, if there's double consonants, there's all the rules. Well, unless they spelled all the letters together. So if it was like DI, like an Italian name, you'd have like D'Angelo or something would be the last name. Then it really depends on how they wrote it, you know. So if usually with the Soundex, they put them all together. So it would be DIA Angelo, and then it would come out. So, but use it, and right, and they may have gotten rid of it, right? So you may have to run 2 Soundexes then, one with the DI and one without. But this is what the census generally looks like. It's a large sheet of paper. So you usually have to zoom in and kind of move it around to see and printing it out really doesn't work. If you have an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, you can't really read it unless you have a magnifying glass. But you know, thank goodness for the computers. But it's really neat because they have now keep in mind, this isn't written in stone either, because the census takers would go door to door and just ask, you know. So I know with one of my grandmothers, whenever they asked her what her name was, she would say Barry, because she was really proud of her last name. But she married a Maloney, but they always called her by her maiden name, Mary Berry. So the census taker went to the door, and they got my grandfather Ed, and they asked a neighbor. So these census takers got paid by how many names they had on their sheet. So if they went to a building with, you know, an apartment building and had multiple, you know, they'd knock on one door, they wouldn't get an answer. Go to the next door. Someone answers. Oh, okay. Well, hey, by the way, do you know these guys across the way? They'd be like, oh yeah. And they say, oh, what's the main guy's name? Oh, okay. And so a lot of times the neighbor would be the one giving you information. So when they asked what his wife's name was, the guy said Barry. And so the guy put the name Barry Maloney. So it looked like a male, you know. So you had Ed Maloney and Barry Maloney on the census, and that's why I couldn't find him. And then until I went through, you know, by hand, because I knew where they lived, and you can do it geographically when you actually go there, because they have maps and you know what district they were in, and you can look at the neighbors and stuff like that. And I found him. I'm like, wait, Barry, and I'm like, it's Mary Berry. So, so immigration and naturalization. This might take a minute. So this I thought was funny. Sorry. Sorry to all the Italians. So immigration and naturalization, two different things. A lot of times we hear it lumped together. So immigration is actually the process of getting here. Naturalization is the process of becoming a citizen. You don't have to worry about this, but if you ever want to look through manually on microfilm all the old ship manifests, the National Archives in the Great Lakes region has all that. Now, luckily, Ancestry and Family Search have gone through and digitized all of them and created an index. However, again, I said the index is only as good as the person who's reading the document. So if you can't find them, but you know what ship they're on, and they're like, I know they got here because I got their naturalization paperwork, and here's the ship they came in, and then you can actually go there and say, I need the ship manifest for this ship, for this date, and then they'll bring you the ship manifest. You can look through it by hand. Otherwise, the passenger lists online are pretty good, depending on how far you're going back. So the National Archives have all the immigrant arrivals from 1820 to 1982. So pretty recent. So the ship manifest will actually be airline manifests, for a lot of people, if it's recent. Pre-1820 records, there was no customs service. So usually those older records are housed at the port of entry. So let's say back in 1810, someone came into New York via Canada, and New York would have the records, and you may not find them on Ancestry because they're so old, unless Ancestry bought their records and digitized them and put them online. So older records at the port of entry. From 1820 to 1890, the U.S. Customs Service maintained the lists, and from 1891 onward, the Immigration and Naturalization Service controlled, and now it's the U.S. CIS, which is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, is what they call it now. And they do have a genealogy section. So if you look up the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, they have a genealogy section. So if you're looking for stuff that you can't find from the National Archives because it's actually newer, a lot of times they can help you out. Information on passenger lists, the further you go back, weren't very good. It just would list usually name, age, sex, occupation, country where you left, country where you're going, and whether or not you died at sea. Post 1893, there's a lot more information. So the earlier it is, the less information. The later it is, the more information. A little word of advice: when you go on Ancestry or Family Search and you're looking at a manifest, if you find your relative, it doesn't tell you this when you're in the program, but you'll come, once you click on your relative's name, you'll see something like this, and you'll find their name over here somewhere. In this case, it was Apollonia Markowska. I was doing this work for a friend of mine. And interesting with the Polish names and a lot of the Eastern European names, if the woman was traveling alone, her last name ended with an A. If she was traveling with her husband, it ended with an I. Yeah. So even though their name was always Markowski, if the woman was traveling alone, they would put it on the manifest as Markowska. So something to keep in mind when you're doing your searches. And then the one thing I wanted to, you see this little scribbling here? That means nothing to nobody. If someone you figured is just doodling on the ship manifest. This is actually shows that this person eventually naturalized. And why do you know that? Because that number is usually, it's a 2-digit number with numbers after and a date. They had to go back and find, when people naturalized, they wanted to make sure they came here legally. So when you went to file your petition, you had to tell them what ship you came on and what time. So they would go through the old ship manifest, and they would write a note in there. Oh, there's the person I'm looking for. And they would write their certificate of arrival number on the ship manifest. So that gives you her date of naturalization. So there's information that exists, and she naturalized in March of 1942. So it's a little hint, just little doodles that you see in certain documents. Now the other thing is, this is actually a lot bigger than it looks. So this is a very long document. They don't tell you in Ancestry, this is what you'll see. You got to hit the little arrow at the bottom. So there'll be 2 little arrows to go left and right, because if you look at the top, it says list of or manifest of alien passengers for the United, and then it stops, because there's a whole side of the sheet that's over here that you'd never see if you didn't hit the little arrow. And so you need to keep track of the number that's next to their name, because this is number 7. So when you go to the next page, you have to find the number, and then this is the rest of her information that goes across. So you'd never know that existed unless someone told you. So naturalization, here's Einstein receiving his certificate of naturalization. We fast-tracked him. He had a lot of information we needed to build a bomb. So he hightailed it to the US when he got out of Germany. And so he became a citizen really quick, and then gave us the information that he later regretted giving us. Actually, a lot of the guys that worked on this project were really sad about what happened when they exploded that bomb. But he naturalized. Now, when you're going through your family paperwork, you may see something like this, a certificate of naturalization. This was given to the individual once they naturalized. The further you go back, sometimes they didn't keep copies, and this may be the only copy that you find, but there's more information than just this. So if you find this in your family documents, it doesn't mean that this is all that exists regarding their naturalization. You're going to be looking for the paperwork they actually filed back when, and then once they were given that, they weren't given copies of that. They submitted that to the courts, and then they gave them the certificate of naturalization later on. You're looking for different types of paperwork, declaration of intention, the petition, stuff like that, that still exist in the courthouses. Even after the Immigration and Naturalization Service came up, you could still naturalize in any court. So you can go to a county court, a local court. You didn't have to go to a U.S. court to naturalize. So and originally, before INS, you just went to whatever courthouse was nearby if you wanted to naturalize. So the first thing you would do is after you've been here 2 years, you'd file your what's called your declaration of intention. In the census, this would be a little mark of a PA. So when you look over the census, it'll say citizenship. And if some of them will say NA for naturalized, some will say they were born in Illinois, so they don't need any naturalization information. Some might have a AL next to it. That means they're still an alien and didn't file any paperwork. And then if they see PA on there, it means they filed their declaration, but they haven't finished the process yet. So you get little hints in the census records. So you didn't have to file your petition in the same court that you filed your intention, because you may have moved. So you may have, imported to Detroit. You went to your local thing. After 2 years, you filed your declaration to become a naturalized citizen. Then you had to wait another 3 years before you filed your petition. Then you brought in friends of yours that could vouch for what a good person you were. And so there was a process you had to go through. Interestingly enough, if wives derived their citizenship from their husband. So if the male member of the family came over and naturalized before 1922, nobody else had to fill out a naturalization form. They all automatically got citizenship. So you won't find naturalization paperwork for the wife or the kids. As long as they were underage and the wife, and it was before 1922, if the man naturalized, everyone else automatically got their citizenship. After 1922, the females had to file their own paperwork. So the weird thing is that if you were a woman before 1922 and you married someone who wasn't a U.S. citizen, you lost your citizenship. You were no longer a U.S. citizen. You had to then file your own paperwork to naturalize, even if you were born here. So it's really kind of strange. So you will see what's called repatriation. So someone would marry foreigners, and then it was before 1922, and after 1922, they had to file their own paperwork. So they would actually have to file just like everybody else to become a citizen again. So. And there's Einstein's petition or declaration of intention, which a lot of times during certain time frames, you'll actually have photographs of the individual. So with Einstein, it was in the 40s, I think primarily 30s and 40s, early 50s, they included photos. Prior to that, not so much. After that, not at all. And then the petition has a lot of information on it. So after 3 years, you could file your petition. From 1790 to 1906, any court of record would accept a citizenship application. There were no standardized forms prior to 1906, so each court had its own forms. So certain courts asked a lot of information, certain courts asked almost nothing. So it really depends on where they naturalized. But the naturalization information has kids' information, dates of birth, country of origin, where they were born. The interesting thing when I was doing this for a friend of mine, his name is Markowski, they've always known themselves as being Polish. When I originally looked up their index, I said, dude, it says you were born in your grandfather was born in Germany. And he's like, we're not German. And I'm like, I'm just telling you what it said. And then when I pulled the petition at the bottom, here's the certificate of arrival and what name he was using at the time. So his name was actually Markowska because he was a kid. So when he came over with the mom, all their names were Markowska. So, so that's one way of finding it. On his petition, it said, "I was born in Germany of Polish parents. We were only there 6 months so they could work, and then we moved back." So he actually put a little note on his petition to make sure everyone knew he was Polish and not German. So now, when you look up on Ancestry and whatnot, the index, they do have indexes to naturalization petitions. You want to pay close attention to what court it is. So here's Joseph Markowski's petition. He became a citizen through the U.S. District of Chicago. That means it was the federal courts. So his information would be at the National Archives, and they have all the naturalizations from the federal courts. And that, again, is on Pulaski. You can just Google NARA, Great Lakes region, and all the information's on there. They're open to the public now. I think you might need an appointment, but call ahead because there's all this, masks, no masks, that sort of thing. Now, it may say Circuit Court of Cook County, Illinois. In that case, don't go to the National Archives because they'll look at you and say, well, you made the trip for nothing because they naturalized in the Circuit Court of Cook County, not at a federal court. And there you would go down to the Daly Center downtown. So on the 11th floor of the Daly Center is the Cook County Clerk of the Circuit Court Archives. They have all the naturalizations from Cook County. All right. Now I'm going to cut it off. There's a lot on military records that I can break down to a very simple, since we don't have the time. The best way to get military records, it used to be fairly complicated. Now it's fairly easy. You go to the NARA website. I think it's on there. And I also have a sheet that used to be part of the form. You don't need that form anymore, but I love the sheet because it tells you the location of who has the military records depending on what service it was and what time frame you're looking for and what address and phone number. So in the handouts, the last page, I believe, is what used to be part of the form SF 180, which was a written form you had to fill out to get military records. They still have them. Most people just go online to nara.gov and you go to a little thing that says eVet Rex. It's in the handout. You click on it and it'll walk you through the process. So bad news is that a lot of the Army's records were burned for a large chunk of, here you have military holdings of the National Archives. The problem was, and we'll go to it real quick, that's the National Archives website. I'm going to skip ahead to the negative news. They do have Civil War stuff, huge amounts of Civil War information. So if you have a relative that was in the Civil War, on the Union side anyway, they didn't really keep the Confederate side. They got rid of all that just because we didn't like them. But yeah, they do have them. But when you go for like a pension record, none of them got pensions. So yeah, so I'm saying there's a lot of Civil War pensions from the Union side, especially pensions have a lot of information. Now, you can, if they didn't get a pension, they'd still have an enlistment. They have all that. So you get the original enlistment form, where they enlisted at, where, what dates they served. If they did get a pension, which one of my relatives did, you get a plethora of information. So it used to be they'd send you the paper copies when I got them, and it was about this thick. And it was like $75. And to get the pension, they needed letters from neighbors. They needed letters from people saying you were healthy before you went to war, and when you came back, you had this problem. They needed letters from your commanding officer. They needed letters from the Army surgeon. They needed, all this stuff in order to get a pension. And your family history. Were you married before? How many kids do you have? What are the dates of birth? What church did you get married in? So you have a lot of information if someone had a pension. Easiest way to do it now, nara.gov. Regardless if it was Civil War or recent, you go to the same thing, eVet Rex. They have a form to fill out online. You request it. Generally speaking, they're pretty fast. It used to be 10 days, or I should say it used to be 6 months, and then the guy I knew that took over got it down to 10 days. So they're really pretty fast now, and they will send you a CD. So they'll digitize it all, and they'll mail you a CD with all of the information on it. Unless it's just a small amount, then they'll just attach it to an email as a PDF. But if there's a lot in there, they will send it to you. So that's the quickest way to go over military records without getting too in depth. One thing to keep in mind, because there was a fire at St. Louis in the 1970s, the Personnel Record Centers had a lot of the Army's records from 1918 through Vietnam. Most of them, they estimated about 70% loss. don't get too upset. They can reconstruct them. So what they did is there was a fire. They brought they doused all the records with water. They brought them out to a parking lot. They dried them out and put them right back. They didn't separate pages, nothing. And so unless someone requests it, they're not going to go back through this old nasty paperwork. If you do request it, they'll go take it into a clean room and they'll have people wearing white coats try to peel the pages apart and actually reconstruct the record. So now, one thing, if you do get the nasty letter from them saying, sorry, your records are gone, they burned in the fire, one thing to check is the local county recorder where the person lived at the time when they got out. So it was a very important piece of paper. There weren't a lot of copy machines, around for people that, and people didn't have safes. A lot of people. So if you wanted to keep something safe, you brought it down to the county recorder, and they would keep a copy of it for safekeeping. So it wasn't all just about mortgages and deeds and whatnot. If you had something important, they will record anything you want. I could take a picture of myself, go down to the Cook County Recorder's office and say, I want you to record this picture, and they'll do it for a fee. But they do have a special section for military records because the counties allowed the veterans to do it for free. So they could go down there and record their military documents for free. And then, of course, the original is down in St. Louis. It burns, but the copy at the recorder's office still exists. So it's nice to, yeah, yep. So, and then the VA might have something. So if they were sick during the service, a lot of the files were transferred to the hospital that they were at, and then therefore the records weren't in St. Louis during the fire. So there's always a chance the VA may actually have copies of records too. There's always ways. If you have any questions, give me an email. So I'm going to shoot back down to like I said, a lot of this, yeah, it's about the fire. I covered that. I'm going to go to the end, put my email on there. This is my grandfather's. I tried 5 times to get his military discharge. I got 5 letters saying it didn't exist. And then when I went back, I noticed that the letter they sent me, it said, oh yeah, we couldn't find his records, but we used payroll records to reconstruct it. When I filled out the original form, I had a serial number. It didn't match. So I said, this is the wrong number. And you guys gave me the wrong number. And so I contacted the guy who was the head of the archives, and I said, I'm having a problem. And he said, give it to me. Send it to me directly. I sent it to him. A week later, I get this. So you could see the burn marks on the paper. Like it was almost ready to go up in flames, and luckily it was saved. And I was able to find out, this is his discharge. I was able to find out that he was in an airplane on D-Day as a mechanic of a plane that was sending supplies, dropping supplies to the paratroopers who went over and were behind enemy lines. So what awards he got, what his rank was, really kind of cool. So, and like I said, county recorder's office or the VA. But if you need to get a hold of me, if you have any questions as you're going through, yeah, well, that's my website. I got that years ago when I was still a cop, and I thought someday I'm going to retire. And the internet was just coming out. The World Wide Web was just coming out. And I said, I might do some history stuff when I retire. I'm going to steal that name right away before someone takes it. And I hung on to it for years. And I said, now I can use it. So it's fairly easy. Historycop.com. My email address is chicagohistorydetective@gmail. So, but you can get all that on the website as well. So, and I do answer emails. So if you have questions as you're going through this, specific questions like, hey, my relatives check, where do I look for check records? Which if you did have a question, it's Riverside Library is where you want to go for that, because the Czechoslovakian Genealogical Society has all of their stuff at the Riverside Library. But any other questions, specific, if we got time? What's that? All over, libraries, history societies. Yeah, you can go up here. I'm going to start putting my calendar up there about where I'm talking, stuff like that. I haven't done it yet because life gets in the way, but I'm trying to think I'm doing this class in Lamont coming up, and then I do a class on tips, tricks, and little known sources where we go over business records, organization records, deceased personnel files. I mean, there's all these different things out there that the more you get into it, the more you're going to find. And exactly. It's a lot. So, and like I said, I've been doing it for 40 years. I'm not done. Although I did find out that I used to live in Brookfield. I did find out that I was related to the guy who founded Brookfield, S.E. Gross. And they used to call it Grossdale when it was before it was Brookfield. And he wasn't a nice guy from what I read, but I'm related on his mother's side. But the lucky thing is, once I found that out, there was some family history there, and I've always wanted to be part of the Sons of the American Revolution. Now, some of my relatives were Mennonite, and they were here during the time, but they didn't fight on either side, so nobody trusted them. And they actually helped some British soldiers, and they were going to be executed for treason. And George Washington actually saved them because he knew the pastor who was the mayor of the church and said, they were just practicing their religion, just fine them, don't kill them. So if it wasn't for Washington, I wouldn't be around, but which is kind of a cool story. But I couldn't get into the Sons of the American Revolution because they were helping the British. And then I find out that someone related to S.C. Gross, the further back, they actually made swords for the Revolutionary Army. And so now I got to find receipts to show that he got paid for doing it, and then I can join. But mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. Yeah, 1600s. Yeah, lots of stuff. Mm-hmm. Oh, there's all sorts of stuff on Jamestown. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, because they were still, I mean, they were still here, and they kept the old records before we were the United States. So they had governors, the different colonies before we were the states, and they keep those records. So the older the records are, the more there are. You would think that there'd be less, and there's a lot of stuff like towns used to keep their meeting minutes, and so you find out, what they did when they lived there, what jobs they had. A lot of them became surveyors and constables, but there's a lot about Jamestown. I actually had a client, I think his goal was to belong to every genealogical society ever created, which was good for me, and it was fun. And he had a lot of old relatives, and we got him to the Jamestown Society, the Mayflower Society, um, Daughters of Early American Witches. So there is yeah, so it was a male witch, but they had one member of the family who was a witch hunter, and there's a lot of information about the witch trials. They kept all those documents. And so the one relative, there were two brothers. One was accused of being a witch, and the other was a witch hunter. So he had one brother actually trying the other one, and he wasn't, they didn't convict him, but a lot of them did get convicted. But yeah, but there's all sorts of societies out there. DAR, Daughters of American Revolution, Sons of American Revolution. Yep, yep. And they used to have, well, it used to be GAR. Now I think they call it something different. So GAR was the Grand Army of the Republic. So it was like a society of all the Union veterans of the Civil War. And eventually all died. And now they have they call it something else, but it's like descendants of people from the GAR and stuff like that. So it's a lot of fun. JEDCOM. Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Now you can download you can get your DNA and do a DNA GEDCOM too. So a lot of I think it's Ancestry and Family Tree, I think are the two ones that when you have your DNA, you can actually download the results like in a computer format. And then you can upload them to different DNA sites, so you don't have to necessarily um, have to do each separate test and pay for it. So I think the two that I would look into based on I did CGI genetics, so it's a long story, but my dad always wanted to do his DNA, and then unfortunately he died. I got him to test for ancestry, but I'm sorry, 23andMe, and so you have to spit in a little tube, and you got to keep spitting and spitting, spitting until you get enough spit to fill the line, and you close the tube and wrap it up and ship it off in the mail. And if you're lucky and everything works right, they send you back, the digital thing, and you just have a login, and you can see who you're related to and what, blah blah blah, and how far back and what your, earliest male ancestor was, your earliest female. Of course, women you can't because you don't have a Y chromosome, so you only have the maternal side. But anyway, so his test came back that there was something wrong with it. So he must have did it after he ate something and didn't wait long enough. And so they probably had like, he was related to a turkey or a pig or whatever he ate that day. So they said this didn't work. So then he got sick and he went in the hospital. He never came out of the hospital and he was unconscious. So I'm like, how am I going to get? So I said, I looked up different DNA tests that where you didn't need to spit in a tube, where you could do a swab. Now we didn't have a lot of time because they were like, he could go anytime now. I'm like, so I just called the CGI genetics and I said, could you send me a kit? And they said, okay, it'll be about a week. And I'm like, it's going to be too late by then. So I just went out to Walgreens and I got a brand new thing of envelopes and I got a brand new thing of Q-tips. And I came out, I went up to his room. I told my mom to watch the door because it's going to look weird. And I took the Q-tip and I like swabbed the inside of his mouth. And because I know something about like being a cop, how to preserve certain evidence. So I had the nitrile gloves and the whole thing. And I did the thing. I put it in a paper envelope. I let it dry, didn't touch it. When the kit finally came a week later, I took their kit and I took my swab and I put it in there and shook it up and then sent it in and it came back. So I was able to get his DNA back. So yeah, which was really kind of cool. Yes. So it's become a lot easier in Illinois. So the quick answer is you go online to, I think it's just called ci.org. They're called the Confidential Intermediary Service of Illinois. Um, they give you a whole list of things to do and how to do it. Basically, you send for their original birth certificate, which you can get now if the person's deceased. Okay. Um, because 10 years ago, Illinois said we don't want to have the liability of having to keep all these things secret on our head. So they sent out letters based on the Social Security, not Social Security, but DMV. So if you had an ID, they did a mass mailing, and if you got something from the DMV, it'll say if you ever put something up for adopt, if you were ever adopted or you ever put someone out to be adopted, sign this if you want to remain secret. Now, if you were dead already, then you couldn't obviously send the form back. So for the last 10 years, unless someone specifically said, I do not want to be identified, you can, for 15 bucks, you send to the downstate, to the Department of Public Health, and you want a copy of their original birth certificate before they were adopted. And then with that, you then contact the CI, and they'll tell you that. So if you go to just Google that, it'll come up to a website called Confidential Intermediary. It used to be free. Intermediary, so it's like INTERMEDIARY, intermediary. They call it a CI. CI.org, I think is the actual website, or C-I, I don't know. Google, it'll come up. It'll be the first thing that comes up. And there's a checklist of everything you need to do. And then they actually, you fill out a form, you file it with the courts, doesn't cost anything. You can do it yourself. You don't need an attorney. They walk you through it, go down to the courthouse where you believe that the court where you believe they were adopted in the county. And then it goes before a judge. You never have to go to court. Judge just signs off on it, sends it back to the CIs. Then they get access to all the adoption information and they send it to you. And if the person's still alive, they will let you know. And then they'll contact the actual person and say, do you want to get together? And if they say yes, then they put you together. Otherwise, you'll just get the information. If they're deceased, you get everything they have in their files. So it's a. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Now, a more complicated way of doing things before the law changed is a lot of people didn't know that adoptions had to be published in the newspaper prior to 1965. But there's no index. And it's only in one newspaper called the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. And that's only housed at the Northwestern University the Rinn Law Center downtown. And so you have to call them, make an appointment. And if you have a date or a close date, because the process was, if you wanted to adopt a child, you had to file a petition with the court, and that petition went into a legal notice that was only published in this one newspaper that nobody read other than lawyers and judges. So nobody knows about that. But it's complicated because you have to look through manually. They'll say all the petitions to adopt baby so-and-so. This man and this woman petitioned the courts to adopt baby so-and-so. And then usually about 3 months down the line, you'll see the order. Judge so-and-so orders that the adoption should go through between baby so-and-so. Sometimes it's a whole name. If the baby had a full name, the full name would be listed. Not the parents' names, but the adoptive parents' names. So that's why you'd be able to find out who adopted them, and get what their name became, at least the last name. But the CI is a lot easier. You don't have to do all that. And whatever they have, they'll give you. And last time I looked, it was free. They said they were getting some grant money or something. I think normally it was like $500, but for the longest time, it's been free because they haven't used the money, and a lot of people don't know about it. So, and I've done it for other people. It does work. Yeah, you're welcome. All right. Yeah, a lot of information. A lot of information. There's so much. My head's just full, and yeah, yeah. You have to stay focused. Yeah, you have to stay. The way I did it is, and most people don't do it full time, and I know I don't. I, especially my own, and a lot of times you set it down, you don't touch it for a year or so, and then you say, I got some time off. I think, no, I'm going to look at this, and then you do a little bit more and a little bit more, and then if you wait a year, more records turn up that you didn't know existed, and then you find something else out, and so you're not going to finish. Everyone always say, I get these emails sometimes, how much would it cost for you to do my family history? And it's like, you know, the volunteers at the Family History Center at the Mormon Church have a lot of funny stories. This one guy came in, he was the owner of a company, and he just brought the name of his secretary. And he said, I want to give her a Christmas present. This is her name. Could you give me your family history, please? The guy's like, what? Yeah, no, well, I mean, you could do family histories without permission, give public records, but what? No, when was she born? I don't know. What? No, it doesn't work like that. He was the owner of a company, so that's how he's used to doing things. He goes to the people below him and says, "Get this done." And he walked in there, and they said, "No, first you got to do this. You got to. It's a big." And the guys get frustrating. And I don't want to go through all that. I just want her family history. It doesn't work like that. So they have the patience of saints sometimes in there. But all right. Well, thanks a lot. Um, I know we went a lot longer than we should have, but
It's okay. It seems like everyone was into it, so I
yeah,
let it go on. Do you mind terribly if I get a PDF of your presentation just so I can send it
oh,
out over
sure.
email to attendees, especially since the folks on Zoom didn't get the
Yeah, what
first
I'll
bit of
do
it because
is
of my
I'll just,
mistake?
yeah, I'll just leave it on the computer if you want,
Yeah,
or if you
perfect.
want me
Yeah, I
to,
can
yeah,
I'll just PDFify
yeah,
the PowerPoint and
yeah,
send it out.
exactly.
And I'll send it out to you guys too. So don't worry about that. I'll send it out to everybody whose email address was registered for the program. Yeah. Yes, and there should be a recording as well. So the recording actually went through without a hitch, despite the other tech hiccups.
Wow.
So that should be okay.
Okay.
So thanks so much, everybody, for coming, and thanks for generously giving your time and answering all those questions too.
Oh, no problem.